Welcome to the Future of Ground Transportation podcast, where we discuss the exciting innovations that lie ahead for organizational ground transportation. Each episode, we cover topics tailored to those resolving transportation-related challenges and provide tips, tools, and trends that will inspire you to stay ahead of the curve. And now, here's your host, Daniel Perez.
Welcome to the Future of Ground Transportation. Today we have a special guest, Anna Vanderspek with Green Energy Consumers Alliance. Anna,
Hiya.
welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. So Anna is a electrical vehicle program director at Green Energy Consumers Alliance. Is a Massachusetts and Rhode Island based nonprofit organization empowering consumers and communities to speed a just transition to a zero carbon world. And in her role, she manages the organization Drive Green programs, which educates consumers about electrical cars and helps them make the switch, and also advocates for smart and clean transportation policy at the state level. Again, Anna, it's a pleasure having you tonight. For all the listeners, we're going to dive deeper into the micro and micro level from the green electrification vehicles, and we're going to talk a little bit about what's happening at the state and hopefully a little bit nationwide if you have context at a national level, and we could dive deeper. So tell us a little bit about yourself, about your bio, and how you guys started at Green Energy Consumers Alliance.
Sure. I'll start by again saying thank you very much. It's exciting to be here. This is an audience I don't get to interact with or talk to that often, so I'm excited to be here. I joined Green Energy Consumers Alliance back in 2015. The organization itself is over 40 years old and has been around running programs for energy consumers for a long time. Started actually as a heating oil buyers co-op in the 80s. A bunch of neighbors got together and said, if we approach a heating oil dealer as a unit, then we can negotiate a lower price per gallon. And we still run that program. We definitely are helping our heating oil consumers use less oil through energy efficiency and other means. But basically, the organization has taken that model of aggregating consumers and applied it to renewable energy technologies. So we can help people get solar or heat pumps or electric cars. And we take what we learn with that interaction with real people trying to adopt these technologies, but also suppliers in the marketplace to inform the advocacy work that we do at the state level. So I joined in 2015. In 2016, we launched a program called Drive Green that helps individuals make the switch to electric cars. So in the almost 8 years that we've been running that program, we've done a lot of consumer education, worked with a lot of car dealers, gotten very familiar with the federal and state and utility incentives, and just generally learned a lot about the opportunities and the barriers in this space. And a lot of what we learned there, I think, applies to fleets as well.
Got it. Thank you for the context, Anna. And tell us, you mentioned about the barriers. What were the barriers when you first sort of embarked on this journey, and where are we from where we started, or when you started from day one?
So the barriers when we started and the barriers that we have now look very similar, but have just sort of transitioned a little bit. So back in 2016, when we launched the program, there were effectively no all-electric vehicles on the market that got over 200 miles of charge that weren't Teslas. At that time, if you wanted to get an electric vehicle, you had the Tesla, you had the Nissan Leaf, which at that time got 107 or 126 miles of charge, miles of range per charge. And then you had a couple Ford plug-in hybrids, and that was about it. And so at that time, the main issues were lack of supply, high cost, and lack of charging. Now we're still in the high cost, although that's changing a little bit. We're still in the lack of supply, although that's changing a little bit. And we're still in the we don't have a strong enough charging infrastructure built out, although that's changing as well. And I'm happy to dive into each of those, what has changed and what sort of federal policy in particular has been driving that change. But I'll say that there's a lot more choices now There's a lot more charging infrastructure than there was 8 years ago, but we still have a long way to go on both fronts.
Perfect. Yes, thank you again. I really appreciate it, especially for all the ground transportation operators and trucking companies and folks that are looking to electrify their vehicles and move into the electrification and electrical vehicles. There's definitely a lot of grants out there that the out of state and out of federal level that we will talk about today, which is why I found conversation with Anna so interesting to make sure that we could bring more awareness across the state and hopefully across the nation too. So tell us a little bit about let's dive deep with when you mentioned high costs. So help us understand at a high level the high costs and where we are today and sort of the roadmap, if you will.
Sure. One thing I'll add first to my previous statement was in 2016, if you wanted a heavy duty or a medium duty electric vehicle, you were kind of out of luck. There were some companies out there that might retrofit an existing Ford F-150 or Ford Transit or something like that, basically come in and install a battery for you, sort of aftermarket. But buying a new all-electric medium or heavy duty vehicle was just not a thing in the United States, and now it is. So that is also a big shift that we've seen, and there's a lot of growth happening in that space too. But to answer your question about costs, the main factor that has from the beginning caused electric vehicles to have a higher upfront cost is the cost of the battery. And so a lot of that has to do with the minerals and the battery components, but a lot of it also just has to do with this is a scaling up an existing industry. We've been building lithium ion batteries for a while for laptops and computers and all that, but this is much bigger at a different scale, and that takes time to scale up. So there's lots of different analysts out there who are looking at the costs of producing electric vehicle batteries, and Bloomberg New Energy Finance in particular has a lot of really cool data on this front. But basically the cost of manufacturing a battery has dropped dramatically over the past decade. That cost curve looks a lot like the cost curve for LED light bulbs. When LED light bulbs and solar, for example, first came out, it was very high cost, but those costs dramatically fell more than linearly over time, and EV batteries have been doing something similar. And the point at which we'll reach cost parity for the cost that it takes to produce a new gas or diesel powered vehicle versus a new electric vehicle, various analysts put somewhere later this decade. So somewhere before 2030, we should reach a point where battery costs have fallen enough that producing a new electric vehicle will cost about the same as producing a new gas-powered car. And at that point, presumably, the cost of purchasing a new electric vehicle or a new gas or diesel-powered vehicle will be about the same. And at that point, the fact that these vehicles have much lower fuel and maintenance costs will help us reach that tipping point. In the meantime, we have a lot of federal and state incentives to help cover that gap, but that cost parity point is expected sometime before 2030.
Got it. Thank you, Anna. And I'm not sure how educated you are as far as the context from a workforce and from a maintenance perspective, especially for large fleets. When we first enter into the electrical vehicle space with heavy duty vehicles, there's a major gap for servicing this type of equipment and maintaining them. Where do you think we stand as of today?
So that gap is definitely there. There's a lot of learning that needs to be done, or a lot of upskilling that needs to be done. I hear about this most often in my line of work in the realm of school buses. Because there's a lot of focus on electrifying school buses because of the public health benefits. We're transporting kids with sensitive lungs. It just makes sense. The vehicles are stationary for a lot of the summer and they can serve as grid assets. So that's the space where I hear about this the most. And what I hear is you can absolutely train people, and you absolutely need to build that into any fleet electrification plan. So there's both the training of the drivers. How do you handle plugging in at the end of the shift? What is regenerative braking? How do you drive to maximize the efficiency of the vehicle? And then there's also the training of the folks who do the maintenance. And there, the big difference, of course, is that you've got a really high voltage battery on these things. So you need to be able to work around that safely. And there are various training programs that exist to help fleets do that. And in Massachusetts, I know a lot of the community colleges that have programs around becoming a vehicle technician in general are starting to add curriculum around how do you work on high voltage vehicles like traditional hybrids or also plug-in hybrids or battery electric vehicles. So I think that is one of the places where the growing pains. This is new. We have to build all that out. There's some good progress, but obviously lots more to be done.
That's awesome. Perfect. Thank you. So let's transition a little bit to the infrastructure. Help us understand, Anna, how is the state getting involved in bridging that gap, and give us a little bit of the ins and outs.
Would it be useful to first talk about the different types of charging, or should I just? Okay.
Is it?
So there are effectively two types of charging that fleet vehicles and also passenger vehicles use. One is level 2 charging that will add 12 to 50 miles of range per hour spent charging. And it is the cheaper of the two types of charging to install. So if you own an electric vehicle and you're lucky enough to live in a place where you can install a charging station for your own use, this is the kind of station you might use overnight to refill your battery, or this is the kind of station you'll see at movie theaters or malls or supermarkets where you can charge for a couple of hours while you're doing something else at a relatively low cost. The next level up is DC fast charging, the DC standing for direct current. These are much more expensive to install, but they charge way faster. And so for individual drivers, you'll most likely interact with DC fast chargers if you're going on a road trip and you need to stop somewhere for half an hour to fill your tank, so to speak, up as quickly as you can. That's the way that most people will interact with DC fast charging. For fleets, it gets very interesting because there are pros and cons to having level 2 or DC fast charging, depending on what vehicles you're driving, how frequently you need to charge them or exchange them. So that we could have a whole conversation about that. And there's probably technical experts who could speak to that more than I can. Regardless of whether we're talking about individuals or fleets, we need more public charging. So there are incentives and lots of funds coming down from the federal government to help build that out. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act set up a program called NEVI, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, that has two parts. The first part is what's called formula funding, where every state receives a certain amount of money based on some formula that I think has to do with the number of residents or something like that. And every state got a certain number of millions of dollars to put towards building out DC fast charging along highways so that there's at least 4 150 kilowatt chargers every 50 miles on interstate highways. So every state in the nation has got that funding. And then there's a second portion where the states have a little bit more leeway on how to use those funds. And then there's a sort of a third category of competitive grant funds, which is, if anybody's heard of the CFI grants, the Community Fueling Infrastructure Grants, where states can put out bids and say, look, we have this really cool project that we'd like to do. So altogether, there's a lot of money coming down from the federal government on that front. And then the Inflation Reduction Act also instituted a tax credit for the installation of charging stations, both for residential and commercial. The caveat with that is that the station has to be located in either a rural or a low-income census block to qualify. There's a map where you can plug in an address and find out if you qualify or not. But that's a tax credit of 30%, up to $1,000 for individuals and $100,000 for commercial entities. And that can go a long way if you're in a location that qualifies towards helping cover those costs. On top of that, lots of different states have different incentive programs. Oh, go ahead.
You said the percentage, you said it was 30% of the cost?
Yes. Let me just double confirm that.
For commercial implement programs?
Yes. So there's important details there, but it covers 30% of the cost if you meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements, and it's not to exceed $100,000. If you don't meet those requirements, or there's a couple others that are better to look at the website and read through the bullet points yourself, then it's 6%.
Yep. Got it. And that's mainly for the infrastructure. That is correct?
Correct. There is also a federal tax credit for the purchase of an electric vehicle as a commercial entity. And there it depends on the incremental cost of the vehicle. So the federal government has a nice website that can help you figure that out. But basically, it is up to $7,500 for vehicles that are less than 14,000 pounds, and up to $40,000 for vehicles that are over 14,000 pounds.
Got it. And I know I asked you this earlier. So most of these, so let's just say we have folks that recently bought buses or heavy duty vehicles. They qualify as long as it's within which parameters? Is it within 3 months, 6 months, 90 days, I believe you mentioned?
It depends on which program we're talking about. So for the federal tax credit, it's the tax year. So at the end of the tax year, you file your taxes, and there's a form, I think it's 45W, if I remember correctly, for commercial entities, and you put in the VIN number of the vehicle that you purchased and the other requirements, and you get that federal tax credit. I do want to make one quick note that if you are a tax exempt entity, so if you're a nonprofit running a fleet, you still qualify through exempt pay. And there's details on that we can share, but if you're a nonprofit entity or another tax exempt entity, you can still take advantage of this tax credit. For the state rebate, in Massachusetts, we have a program called More EV that is available for individuals and also commercial entities. It's available for light duty vehicles and also for medium and heavy duty vehicles. The amount depends on the class of the vehicle. So light duty vehicles have to be battery electric vehicles under $55,000, and those qualify for $3,500. For medium and heavy duty vehicles, there's different price requirements, and the vehicle class determines the amount that you're eligible for. But for those, you have to apply for a rebate online within 90 days of purchasing the vehicle. And there's an easy form to fill out at more-ev.org. Or you can email the More EV Trucks team, which is for the medium and heavy duty vehicles, to apply for that rebate.
Got it. Thank you. Perfect. So let's transition. Anna, this information was very useful. I'm sure that a lot of the folks listening have a ton of questions we talked a little bit about infrastructure. We talked a little bit about the incentives. Anything that we might have missed between the incentives on a state and federal perspective?
I'll run through them again real quick, just because I think sometimes the summary is helpful. So for the vehicles themselves, you've got the federal commercial clean vehicle tax credit. So again, that's up to $7,500 for light duty vehicles and up to $40,000 for heavier vehicles. Then in the state of Massachusetts, you've got the More EV rebate, both for light duty and medium and heavy duty vehicles. In other states, there are other incentive programs, so look up your local state. For installing charging, we didn't quite get a chance to talk about all the incentives. So for installing charging, we did talk about the federal tax credit. So again, that's the one that's up to 30% or 6%, depending on some requirements. But on top of that, we have incentives in Massachusetts, both from our electric utilities and from the State Department of Environmental Protection. So when you're talking about installing charging, there are basically two buckets of costs. There are the infrastructure upgrades, so any wiring or trenching that you need to do to get electrical service to the location where you're actually putting in the station. And then there's the hardware and installation costs of you're actually going out and buying a level 2 unit or a DC fast charger and hooking that up to the service. And those different parts are covered by different programs. So the wiring upgrades are covered by National Grid and Eversource, which are the two big investor-owned utilities in Massachusetts. They cover up to 100%, and the up to is because there's a per port cap, sorry. So that's a little bit of an incentive to install more ports, because the more ports you install, the higher that cap is. And so if you're going to trench through a parking lot, if you're trenching through a parking lot to install exactly one charging station, you might be well over that per port cap. But if you're trenching the same parking lot to install 10 charging stations, you might be able to basically spread the cost of that trenching across those 10 charging stations. So there's a per port cap, but it's up to 100%. There are incentives for public fleets through the utilities, but I think that is not so relevant for this audience. So it's mostly on the wiring upgrade side. And then the state of Massachusetts has a couple of incentive programs for the hardware. And the relevant one here is called Mass EVIP, which stands for Electric Vehicle Incentive Program. There's a workplace and fleet charging incentive program. So it's an incentive for employers and fleet operators to install level 1 or level 2 charging. So it does not cover DC fast charging. Applicants must have 15 or more employees to be eligible, and it covers up to 60% of hardware and installation costs, up to $50,000 per street address. So again, that's called Mass EVIP. The only thing that is, or it's not the only thing, but one particularly confusing piece of this is that the Department of Public Utilities in Massachusetts has ruled that you cannot stack these incentives. So if you apply to National Grid or Eversource and get funding for the wiring upgrades and apply to Mass EVIP to get funding for the hardware, even though those are for different parts of the installation, the DPU is ordered that you have to subtract whatever funding you get for Mass EVIP from the funding that you get from the utility. So depending on your particular situation, it may or may not be worth applying for both. So in some cases, if the wiring upgrades aren't that expensive, maybe it makes more sense to just apply for Mass EVIP. In some places, if it's the wiring upgrades that are more expensive, then it makes sense to apply for the utility incentives. But both of those you can stack on top of the federal tax credit.
Okay. Then when it comes from anything that we might have missed there from a state level on the hardware or the upgrades?
Those are the ones to look at. So from the state level, there's the Mass EVIP program. The utilities will cover the wiring upgrades, and the federal government has that tax credit. Outside of incentives, the state of Massachusetts does have a program called Mass Fleet Advisor, which is a free advisory services program for private fleet operators, where you can go and basically have an expert sit down with you and say, what vehicles do you have? Where are they garaged? How many miles a day do they drive? What kind of body type are they? How old are they? And work with you to figure out, okay, if you want to electrify your fleet, which vehicles are the ones you should start with? How do you install the charging? Which incentives should you go after? There are people there who exist to help you walk through those questions, which is really unique. I don't think very many states have that program. So if you operate a private fleet in Massachusetts that has at least 3 vehicles and at least one of those is a medium or heavy duty vehicle, definitely Google the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center's Mass Fleet Advisor program.
Okay. Do you have a website? I'm sure we're gonna. If you could please share the oldest links, and we could post it on the episode notes. Thank you. And then when it comes into the utility bills and the consumption of energy, I'm assuming, in the essence of the obvious, that the cost is going to go up. Is there any incentives with those, with the addition of those additional costs, or is that just passing to the business, especially focusing on the private fleet
It depends a little bit on where you're located. So the first thing to know is that, particularly for light duty vehicles, but also for medium and heavy duty vehicles, it is cheaper to drive a mile on electricity than it is to drive a mile on gas or diesel. The main reason is that electric vehicles are so much more efficient. They waste a lot less of the energy that you're putting in. And historically, electricity prices have been more stable than gas and diesel prices, with the big exception of last winter or 2 winters ago after Putin's invasion of Ukraine, where natural gas prices went absolutely crazy, and that impacted our electricity prices. But most of the time, electricity prices are much more stable. So you should be seeing a reduction in your fuel costs, even if you're just on the standard product from the utility. If your fleet is garaged in National Grid territory, there is an off-peak charging rebate that is available for fleets. So what that means is electricity use on the grid is not flat throughout the day. There are times of the day where demand really spikes, and those times are more expensive and more polluting for the grid. So National Grid has a program to incentivize folks who drive electric vehicles to not charge during those peak times, because that is good for the grid. It's good for the folks who drive those electric vehicles because their costs go down, but it's also good for everybody else on the grid because that's keeping electricity prices lower for everybody. So if you are a fleet owner in National Grid territory, you can sign your fleet up for this program. And during the summer months, you'll see a reduction of 5 cents per kilowatt hour if you charge off peak. And in the winter months, it's a whole 3 cents per kilowatt hour, which, depending on what vehicles you drive and how often you charge them, that can add up, especially if you're maintaining a fleet. So that's one program to look out for if you're in National Grid territory. If you are in Eversource territory, there's currently no program like that. There may be some coming soon, but one thing that both utilities do have is a demand charge alternative program. So when you as an individual are paying for electricity, what you're paying for is a sort of a basic service charge, which is a flat amount per month, and then you're paying a volumetric charge, so a charge that's multiplied by the number of kilowatt hours you consume. For commercial entities, there's an additional charge called a demand charge, which is based on the maximum power draw that you have in a month. So if you are a fleet operator and you're installing a whole bunch of level 2 charging stations or DC fast charging stations, those might draw power at a high enough level that you would incur a demand charge. For a long time, those demand charges were a big problem, especially for public for public DC fast charging stations, because the charge is very high for a month, but if you don't have that much usage, it's going to be very hard to recoup those costs. And so there's a program now that's called a demand charge alternative, where the level of demand charge you pay is based on how much you actually use that station. So if the station isn't used very much, you get a lot of that demand charge discounted. And I think that for some fleets, it depends on the size and what kind of charging you've installed and how much you use it, but that could be a big help to reduce those demand charges. And I know that's got real wonky real fast, but for the one fleet operator who's listening to this going, but what about those demand charges? I wanted to make sure to get that out there.
Got it. So I just want to make sure that we capture a couple of things that you mentioned. So when you mentioned for off-peak, in order to qualify for off-peak rebates, it has to be at specific times during non-off-peak hours. And then during the summertime, it will be about 5 cents, and winter 3 cents. Was that correct?
Correct. And if I remember correctly, off-peak is defined as 9 p.m. to 1 p.m. I think that's correct. I can double check that. But basically, it's just don't charge at the end of the afternoon. From 9 p.m. to 1 p.m. So charge overnight or in the morning, but not in the afternoon to early evening. Which, if you are driving vehicles during the day, garaging them overnight, and charging them overnight will be when you charge anyway.
Got it. And based on your understanding, especially for high heavy duty vehicles, what is the range? Because I know it varies obviously per vehicle, but do you see that's sort of a couple of challenges that we have in the infrastructure, implementing it within different programs, ground transportation programs that we currently run, because of the miles of the miles of range, right? So, what is your recommendation there? What do you see happening in the near future? Anything that comes to top of your mind that you want to share with the audience?
So I will say that I'm much more familiar with the ranges of sedans, hatchbacks, SUVs. Those are all well above 200, if not 300 miles per charge. In the medium and heavy duty vehicle space, because the vehicles are heavier, the batteries get you less far, basically. So there, I think the range is more in the 100 to 200 mile range. But it depends a lot on what vehicle we're talking about. So anecdotally, I can say that there's a moving company that has an electric box truck in Massachusetts, and I know that gets over 100 miles, and they've been using it to move people and heavy stuff around Massachusetts. The Ford e-Transit is definitely one of the models that I hear about a lot, because there's a lot of Ford Transits out there, and it's a very easy switch because it's the same vehicle, same brand, it's just on electricity. I think that gets somewhere between 100 and 200 miles per range per charge, depending on which configuration you are looking for. I'll say if you're regularly driving 500 miles in a day, maybe start with a different vehicle than that one, unless there are spots along the way where you know you can reliably charge. And this is where I'll put another plug for Mass Fleet Advisor. These questions so quickly get fleet specific that kind of advisory services is really where I would point people to, because if you're driving 20 miles a day in a pickup truck, it might be one thing versus 100 miles a day in a sedan. There's so many different configurations, and that's where that sort of fleet-specific technical advice really comes in handy.
Got it. Thank you. And you mentioned during our pre-recording the Call Star program. Can you give us a little bit of background behind it?
So CalSTART is the vendor, basically, that Mass CEC has chosen for the Mass Fleet Advisor program. So when you go through the Mass Fleet Advisor program, you'll get connected with CalSTART. And CalSTART is a big national, if not international, nonprofit that does a lot of this sort of technical advice. So they have experience with medium and heavy duty vehicles. They track the market really closely. And so they're the ones that are doing that work in partnership with Mass CEC for the Mass CEC Fleet Advisor program.
Got it. And thank you, Anna, any statistics with potential benefits for private operators that are starting to transition, or any statistics that you would like to share that could bring any clarity or any potential benefits to this audience?
So there's a couple of loose statistics that I can share with you. So in general, we talk about fuel costs being lower for electric vehicles and maintenance costs being lower. The fuel costs one depends a lot on what state you're in, because it depends on what you're paying for electricity. And most of the stats that I have are for individual drivers who are paying the basic service rate of our utilities. If you're a fleet, you may be on a different commercial rate, so you might be paying a different rate for your electricity than the math I have. But the math I have says that you save a couple cents per mile driving on electricity in a Chevy Bolt compared to the average gas-powered car. For fleets with heavy-duty vehicles, bigger batteries, that math might be slightly different. And again, that's where I'm going to point to Mass Fleet Advisor. The one thing I do want to point out that I think is often overlooked is the maintenance piece of this. So when we talk about passenger vehicles, we often point to a study from Consumer Reports that said that over the life of the vehicle, you can expect to save somewhere between $6,000 and $10,000, or about half of what you might otherwise spend on maintenance and repairs. For heavy-duty vehicles, medium and heavy-duty vehicles, it depends a little bit more. And I think in some spaces we're so at the beginning that we don't have thousands of data points to point to, and I'll be very honest about that. So I've read a lot of studies, for example, about electric school buses that have said the maintenance costs are going to be lower, but a lot of those are extrapolating from data from passenger vehicles. And I think the principle is true, that because you don't have a lot of the pieces in an electric vehicle that you have in an internal combustion engine, a lot of those costs just don't exist. You don't have to do an oil change if you're driving a pure battery electric vehicle. But for a fleet operator looking at some of these vehicles in the next 3 years, I think there's more data on in some of the vehicle classes than others. But again, that's where Mass Fleet Advisor, they know the latest and greatest. The one thing that is not a statistic, but I'll point to as well, is that there is a lot of policy, both national and international, that is pushing the market towards electric. That I think is easy to not see if you're like at a dealer looking at what they have on the lot. But there are standards nationally, both for emissions and then other, let me start that sentence over. I finished this wrong. There's national standards on pollutants that are going to very quickly clean up the fleet. You've probably seen this. There's a lot in the press right now about the EPA's latest multi-pollutant standards. And then there's also standards that various states have adopted, including Massachusetts and Rhode Island, that are out of California, that will require an increasing percentage of the vehicles that are sold, both light duty and medium and heavy duty, to be electric from model year 2026 to model year 2035. So those are going to be pushing the market a lot in Massachusetts, in Massachusetts and Rhode Island and in the United States. But if you look internationally, we are quite behind Europe and China in particular, which are huge auto markets that are further along than we are. And the manufacturers that are producing vehicles that we drive here are also producing vehicles that are sold in those markets. So I think that there's going to be a swift change, or a lot of progress on that front that we'll see already. There's a lot of vehicles that are available in Europe that are not available here yet. But now that we've got those federal policies pushing us forward and our states have these policies, I think that makes a stronger case for those manufacturers to send some of those vehicles here. So I think there's going to be a lot more choices in the coming years than we've seen so far.
Got it. Perfect. Thank you. Based on your perspective, if you had a crystal ball, Anna, you mentioned at the beginning of the episode that we would probably be fully electric by 2030. Is that correct?
That's a little early. By 2030 is the point where we'll see the cost of manufacturing an EV be about equal to manufacturing a gas-powered car. For passenger vehicles in Massachusetts, we have a law that says by 2035, if you're buying a new vehicle, it has to be electric. And the reason for that is that we've got another law that says we have to reach net zero emissions by 2050, which basically means any carbon emissions we're putting out, we're somehow magically sucking back out of the atmosphere. And so vehicles are on the road for generally 15 years. And so if we need to be all electric by 2050, that means the last gas car has to be sold in 2035. And the standards that I mentioned out of California for the passenger vehicle market are going to facilitate that, because every year from model year 2026 through model year 2035, they increase the percentage of new vehicles that need to be electric. And obviously that's just new vehicles, so it's going to take time to switch over the whole fleet. There's a parallel set of regulations on trucks. It's called the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule. I don't have those percentages memorized because they are different for different vehicle classes, and they definitely don't reach 100% by 2035, but they get the ball rolling. So I hope we are all electric by 2050, because if we're not, we don't have a planet to live on or live on comfortably or safely for our kids. But I think the rate of transition will be different in the different vehicle classes.
Awesome. Anna, again, we got a ton of nuggets. It was super educational, and I'm sure there's a lot of folks within this audience that has still a ton of questions. How can they get in touch with Green Energy Consumer Alliance, and what would be the best way to stay in touch with you or with your organization?
So our website is greenenergyconsumers.org. You can go there to learn about electric vehicles, but also the policy work that we do, or stuff on heat pumps or solar or green power if you're interested in those topics too. I will give a shameless plug for our blog. I think we do a good job blogging on stuff that is interesting to people and understandable, but also not annoying. So hopefully you'll agree. If you read any of our blogs, you can subscribe to that. But if you have any questions that you want to send us on this topic, the best email is drivegreen@greenenergyconsumers.org, and we'll get back to you.
Can we repeat that again? Drive Green?
Yes, drivegreen@greenenergyconsumers.org. Very many E's, but that is the email address.
Perfect. So we will make sure to put it on the episode notes, as well as the key websites that you mentioned and programs on the episode notes. Again, thank you very much for your time, Anna. And before we let you go, what is one book that has the biggest impact on your professional career? And what is the best business or professional advice that you have gotten through your career?
So I'm going to be a real out of left wing here on this question. So I work at a nonprofit, and I don't read a lot of business books, but one book that has really impacted how I work is called Nonviolent Communication. It's by Marshall Rosenberg. It is all about how we can better communicate what we need and listen to people when they are talking, and how to sort of let go of the initial emotional reactions we might have when we're receiving criticism or trying to give criticism or feedback, I should say. But that it teaches us to talk to each other better in a way that we can actually hear each other. So that one sits on my bookshelf, and I look at it from time to time. It has nothing to do with... Sorry?
Very well said. I mean, it's a superpower in business at the end of the day, right? So.
And just in humaning, which is the perspective I probably come from. And in terms of advice, I will also look at this from a very nonprofit, concerned about climate change perspective, but I spend all day, every day trying to figure out how we're going to reduce emissions enough to save people's lives. Quite frankly, I mean, there's people who are already dying because of climate change, and that is just going to get worse and worse and worse, and that can get very heavy. If you're looking at all the reports coming out or reading the news about another flood or landslide or hurricane or heat wave or drought, there's so much evidence out there for feeling overwhelmed. But one thing that my boss said once, and he'll laugh when he hears this, is that we're not losing people from this fight. Like, with every passing day, there are not people going, this whole climate change thing, I was really concerned about it, but now I'm not. It's more and more people realizing this is not just some tree huggery polar bear situation. This is my kid and their future, or this is my neighbor. This is my life right now, my asthma, or my flood, or my food. It is happening now. And so more and more people seeing that only means that we have more and more power to do something about it. So that's something that I try and remember, because otherwise I would go insane.
I appreciate your time. I appreciate what you guys do for society and for our environment. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure having you on the episode. And for all the listeners, to stay tuned. And anyone interested in getting a free consultation on an upcoming ground transportation program, please reach out to us and stay tuned for our next episode. Thank you very much, Anna. Have a great night.
Thank you. It was fun.
Thanks for tuning in to the future of ground transportation. We appreciate you coming along for the ride. If you found value in this episode and want to hear more, please make sure to subscribe to the show.